Hi, everybody. Um, my name is A.J.Keller, and I'm here with Janice Misurell-Mitchell, Chicago composer extraordinaire, and we're here just to talk about a piece that both of us are involved in the production of that is going to be performed this coming October. The piece is called Resistant Noise, which Janice has composed as a commission for the Ear Taxi Festival, and it's going to be performed on the evening of October 3rd at 7:30 at Constellation here in Chicago. So, Janice, would you like to say hi?
Hello, everyone, and we're both very, very pleased to be on the Ear Taxi Festival. I'm amazed at the number of pieces, the wide range of music, and all the venues that the festival committee has created, and we're just really happy to be there, and we're going to talk about my piece and its performance.
Mm-hmm. And I think we'll just launch right into it. So I'm going to be conducting the piece, and you might be performing a little bit in the, we could say, through the act of playing the electronics component. But really, for now, even though you are a performer, you're basically playing wearing your composer hat. Primarily, we'll say. So this is a 20-minute piece for singers and instrumental ensemble and electronics. And this piece actually has a really interesting kind of backstory. And I think a great starting point would just be for us to hear the story behind it. So can you give us a little bit of background on the piece?
Okay, this I call the middle background. Going back to 2011, if you might remember the Occupy movement, I was listening that winter actually to a lot of the sounds and chants and sources of the Arab Spring. And you could get a lot of that on YouTube and on the computer. And I was really inspired by the energy and the sounds of the crowds. And so later that year, I was in New York, it was around December, and I was involved in a march. It was a protest in a march. And there were a wide range of people. And I kind of got in the middle of it. And I started hearing chants. I remember especially it was "The People United Shall Never Be Defeated," both in English and Spanish. And then I think there were civil rights songs before me. And so I was kind of in the middle of 2 or 3 protest songs. And I started thinking it was really like being in the middle of a Charles Ives piece, where you're hearing everything and you recognize the snippets and understand what they're about, but they're kind of happening also as a kind of musical collage. And so there's a general perception you have at the same time. You don't kind of lock into one or the other, but you hear them as a kind of multiple counterpoint. So that was actually an inspiration for me to think of composing a piece that involved both the explicit chants, but also moving vocal music, especially into abstract patterns that came from the chants. Because I'm interested not only in the kind of explicit political messages, but also, you might say, compositional and aesthetic effects of taking a text and presenting it so that it gets stretched and has a kind of other personality to it. And so I'm very interested in the sounds that come from the text and juxtaposing those and playing with those. So that's what the vocal part in this piece involves.
Great. And you have composed multiple pieces that have led up to the construction of this larger work, correct?
Yes, correct. And AJ was one of the people who conducted one of these pieces, which goes way back to the 70s. It's called Mad Song, and it's based on a very short poem by William Blake. And in this song, in this piece, I kind of made a choral piece out of it. I was taking the words of the text and first laying them out so people could hear them, but then also trying to create elements of musical imagery that was within the text. And so the text talks about wild winds weeping. And I took the kind of traditional Renaissance idea of weeping, weep, weep, that expressively the voice is going to descend, and you write music that does that. We know that especially 19th century Lieder does a lot of this as well. So Mad Song again, used a kind of collage, but it also used traditional techniques like canon and counterpoint. And that's an early version of this. I really didn't do anything for large chorus after for many, many years, but I started working individually in producing my own texted pieces, which many of you know involve speaking through the flute, altering your sound through the flute, rather than taking electronics and altering them that way. So I really believe in trying to do this through live performance. I think it has a kind of immediacy. So many of you can find that on YouTube in my individual pieces, but this is very special because it's a much larger concept than I've used before.
Yeah, and you know, you are a composer who's very, very interested in text, not only the actual source material that you work with, but I would say every little component part of the words that you set musically. One technique that you, I think, repeatedly explore is this technique of like textual deconstruction, a kind of playfulness and curiosity about the tactile nature of the sounds of the words that you're setting, which I don't know, it's really fascinating to listen to you actually explore that as a performer. So it's clear that text is really important to you. Can you talk a little bit about the text of resistant noise? Because this is kind of a unique situation in which you have like a 20-minute piece that doesn't have that much text when all is said and done.
Right. This is a text that I actually found when I was organizing my course that I taught one time at the U of C and then at the School of the Art Institute for quite a few years. The course was called Music and the Political. And the text is by Jacques Attali, who's actually known as a French economist more than a writer of polemical texts. And the pieces, the text itself is from a book in 1977 called Bruit, or Noise, and it was translated in 1984. And this is the text, it's very short. With noise is born disorder, and its opposite, the world. With music is born power, and its opposite, subversion. In noise can be read the codes of life: clamor, melody, dissonance, harmony. And those 4 words are very important because you will only hear them in French, but it's not too hard. You get clameur, mélodie, dissonance, harmonie. And I love the cognates, I love the sounds, and it's been great for the singers to kind of learn their French. So that's the text, and it's resistant noise, noise both that is resistant to the status quo, but also sounds of resistance. And what is heard as noise may be understood, as Attali says, it's the music of those who are not represented. And so I'm including sounds that we may call noise or we may not. Contemporary composers may say, that's not noise, that's music. And other people may say, oh my gosh, that's really noisy. So I'm playing with this and laying out the structure in a kind of gradual, logical way.
Yeah, I think that it's worth staying on that point that you just made for just a moment about this idea that like different people from different walks of life, from different professions, different prior experiences are going to have a tendency to hear noise as music, and others are going to have a tendency to hear noise, as kind of sounds that are unwelcome in the world that we occupy, right?
Yes.
And I think that's really fascinating. And this isn't a new idea necessarily. You and I were talking right before we started recording this about, the fact that composers have actually been playing around with noises and trying to kind of turn them into harmonious sound for hundreds of years. You know, that you have examples from the Renaissance period, even of composers documenting street cries and writing in this genre. It's a genre in and of itself, which is called the cries of London. You know, there are multiple composers who set these street cries to music and actual pitches and rhythms. You have the French programmatic chanson, in which composers are trying to depict a battle scene or the sounds of birds in like a wooded landscape using music. And composers have played around with this for forever, really. But so I want to point that out because the fact that this is kind of I don't know if resurrection is the right word, but it is a kind of tip of the hat to these old techniques. I think might allow some listeners, a pathway into understanding this music, because your musical language is drastically different from the language of the Renaissance, for instance. And I'm sure many people watching this are familiar with your work. Can you give the audience, as it were, a little bit of a primer about how it is that you approach composition, what your language is like, what materials you tend to incorporate in your music?
Yeah, okay. The first place, my harmonic language, as most people know it, it could be understood as atonal. I still do often use a row. It may have anywhere between 12 and 25 notes. And if I want to ground it a little bit more, I give a kind of tonic and maybe dominant aspect. I also like to use snippets that may feel like leading tone to tonic. So it's not that it's completely unfamiliar to anybody who knows tonality. But on the other hand, it's also, I love, minor ninths and things like that. And so people will then often hear that as what we say, unstable harmony rather than dissonance. So actually, but going to text, I mean, the primary piece, which is the most influential, is Pierrot Lunaire. And I started thinking way back, I being a flutist, I love to write melodies. I can do that, it's fine. But I didn't want to just set texts, and this goes way, way back when I was in grad school. I didn't want to set texts and just have a pretty piece, or elaborate on a poem and kind of stretch it and make it musical. And that's been done. Other people do it beautifully. I felt I want to explore a little bit more. So that's the reason that I found Pierrot Lunaire was so important, because of Sprechstimme, because I feel that the human voice is capable of a lot of expression and nuance in just using the voice without worrying about pitch. And so this is like heightened inflection and often heightened pronunciation as well. But I felt I'd rather get the sense of the text through a kind of physical element rather than a trained voice. And so that's one reason I use Sprechstimme a lot. And in this piece, that moves, it goes from Sprechstimme to taking abstract sounds. And so let's just take With Noise is Born Disorder. And I've subjected to that because, as many of you know, I also am involved in jazz, not exactly traditional, but I've certainly have studied it. And so we take the English that Atali has, with noise is born disorder. So with noise is born disorder, and its opposite, the world. And so that's the kind of exaggeration, yeah, right, that I like to do. But then we get things like world, and so world has been moved into much more of an abstract pattern, playful, kind of disrespectful pattern, but also it makes people think about language, and that language is still made up of a lot of smaller elements that each can be kind of explored on their own.
Yeah. One thing that you said in one of our last, I think it was probably our last rehearsal with the choir, you said something in rehearsal which I thought was like the perfect summation of your approach to text in this piece with the vocal parts, which is you described the way that they were using Sprechstimme as though they were trying to get the syllables out, but they're not coming out the right way.
Yeah.
And I love that description. That perfectly sums up like this kind of like impotence that you hear in the singer's parts for so much of this piece, where they're just it's exploratory, but it also feels very, very frustrated.
Yes. Okay. I think there are two elements in the frustration part. One is just like stuttering. That's a lot of what I often am doing. But also in maybe the past 6 or 7 years, I've been very interested in the Dada movement. And Dada is taking those and the frustration and just saying in your face, yeah, this. And asking you to make what you make of it, or seeing it as kind of an aggressive statement that is contrary to clear communication.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. So what inspired you to incorporate electronics into this piece? And can you talk a little bit about what people should expect to hear in that element?
Right. Okay. I think this came from my teaching, and that in the course, when we kind of framed it about noise, I thought, as you were talking about street noise, and this going back to the Renaissance, and certainly you have this sensibility going throughout aesthetically in a lot of different ways, and also collage. We are very familiar with visual collages, but I'm really interested in sound collage. And just a little sidetrack on that, that could kind of be inspired by the work of John Cage when you have multiple texts happening at once. But I'm also interested in some elements of clarity. So I felt that I wanted to have the choir reinforced by other sounds, and just to make it more emphatic and to enrich what they were presenting. And part of the idea then is the resistant noise, or noise of resistance. And so at first I thought, well, you know, I make recordings of any protests that I go to, and I've got a lot of stuff there. And I had made some birthday pieces of people after Trump was elected. I did 2016 election blues, and I took some things that I had recorded on my phone, and then I made another funny piece that had quotes of Trump, and we had Deutschland über alles, and and TV commentators, and I had the left and right kind of in conflict, and with the sounds that I had collected both from my phone and also YouTube. And so in this piece, I thought, well, I've got a lot of street protests, and also I've been doing this for a long time. There are a lot of histories, and histories way before me, that involve protests. So I thought I not only want to kind of increase the power of the live singers, but kind of present an educational framework. And so because there are a lot of voices that I knew of and had heard of over the years, and I presented when I was teaching. So the soundtrack ended up having recent protests, but also voices that I felt were very significant from the past. So that clearly would be Martin Luther King, but Paul Robeson, whom not enough people knew about, and I would like them to explore that. So there's some things on YouTube with him. Marian Anderson singing My Country 'Tis of Thee at the Lincoln Memorial. That's in there too, because I want us to remember, well, if you don't know what happened. So maybe the listener a second or third time would say, well, what was the circumstance under which she sang that song? And that we know she was prohibited from giving a recital at the DAR with the Daughters of the American Revolution. And just a little side thing, I don't know if you know or others know, but Leontine Price was invited to perform there. I think it was in the early 80s. And she dedicated the piece to Marian Anderson. And as she says that, she says, a great American, her voice cracks a little, and it just sends shivers. And another thing I like to say, and singers know this too, at the end, Price holds out a note a little too long and is kind of like, yeah, look what I can do. And I love that. These are musical things that I'm referencing, and each one of the voices has a kind of history around it. But we're hearing it as a collage where some things pop out and some things don't. And so if I'll add a little more, and then you can talk more about this. I want the live singers first just to present the piece as singers. And then gradually, as the soundtrack develops, they become participants in the protest themselves. And so they are, by about the first third of the piece, protesting along with the people on the soundtrack. So our singers have become participants. And then there's a question of how much power they have. And there's a lot of interplay between an establishment and my singers. Are they making noise? There is noise, there is violence. What does that mean? And so I'm hoping that this use of the soundtrack will bring the listeners into the environment as well.
Yeah, that it's really great to hear you say all of these things, because we've talked about this piece a bunch, but in rehearsals we really haven't had much of an opportunity to talk to the performers at length about all of these details, which I think really I think, open up people into it. Opens up your world to the performer in a way that's really valuable, because you look at the music on the page that you've written, and I think often from the performer's standpoint, you're not really sure what to make of it, but there's so much thought that goes into every little detail that you've put on the page, and there's this complex web, very clearly a complex web of different impetus for every single element. It's not just a political piece. It's not just, a piece about exploring Sprechstimme and language and atonality. It's not just a piece that is about teaching all of these historical events to people. It's this really complex combination of all of them, which I think is fascinating. And it is one of the cool things about the idea of performing it and premiering it for the public is I'm interested in seeing people's reactions and talking to people afterwards about how they end up experiencing it, which parts stick out to them, because I think it's a piece that is open to a variety of different reactions and interpretations. This is an overtly political piece, obviously, with all of these protest chants, which start off kind of distant, and it kind of starts off sounding like everything is happening behind glass, and then all of a sudden the performers start participating. Not just the singers start chanting, but the instrumentalists as well, and it becomes very chaotic. So it's a very political piece. Given the events of last summer, following the death of George Floyd, when our country erupted into a series of demonstrations in every major city, and given the events on January 6th, with a demonstration turned insurrection, you could say, at the Capitol. These are the two protests that are probably in the forefront of everyone's mind. So when people listen to a piece like this that frames protest as the central act, the physical and musical act within the piece, I think that's probably those are going to be the two things that stick out most in people's minds. But this is a piece, as you've said before, that predates these events. Yes. And it isn't, I think, stuck in any particular time period. You talk about all of these different quotations, these materials that you've stitched together in your electronic track from a variety of different time periods. I don't even think that the piece is necessarily stitched to those time periods either. It seems to be a more universal message about the act of protest and about noise itself. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. When you write a piece, you're not going to necessarily know what events are going to happen. And so I was hoping to write a piece that would have more of a universal sense, issues that have continued for decades and decades. And so that's one reason I also have the voice of Nina Simone. And this is when she's singing Mississippi Goddamn. Well, that certainly references the civil rights movement, but it also could be now. And Oscar Brown Jr., who actually creates a slave auction on Sin and Soul, and then some, I think it's called Sin and Soul. It's a recording that had all sorts of fun jazz things, and then he has bid 'em in, and you get a little snippet of that. So it's people who are referencing the past, but that they're also elements that are contemporary. One thing that I thought, especially Black Lives Matter, which is in there as a chant, and you will get that many times. I got that in Chicago. And then and also ironically, Save Our Planet was done at the same time and is to the same rhythm, which is amazing. But that's what happened. People were really going, Black Lives Matter, save our planet. And so these are things that are certainly current and not locked into any time. I do have something on COVID, and that's kind of there. You have to listen carefully. It's the governors talking about not having enough equipment. And so we have the now status as lowered person of Andrew Cuomo, but we also have our governor, and we have Mayor Lightfoot and the mayor of Michigan, and their voices are collaged, but you can hear them. And so that again is talking about not being served. And at that point, remember that there was a different administration in. So in a way, people making public statements about COVID were also sometimes problematic. So I think we have to see two things: see the time it was written, but also the relevance of those statements to both the present and future, and also the past. And then one other thing, I do have Justice for Mike Brown, which was sung as a kind of interruption during the intermission of the St. Louis Symphony. And they're singing to "Which Side Are You On?" So it's justice for Mike Brown is justice for us all. And it's "Which Side Are You On?" which is not only a civil rights melody, but it kind of goes way back. And so, and has many sources. So I think in listening to this, I'm kind of asking that people understand that these protests are certainly of their time, but they refer both to the future and the past.
Mm. Yeah, and it's funny because I think it's easy for people, especially in the current landscape, to hear some of these protest chants, and everyone has their own relationship to them, right? So you've heard, you may have heard them in a different context than the composer has heard them and remembers them,
Sure.
and therefore you're gonna kind of graft something different onto the piece than is necessarily intended by you, Janice.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting. And it's one of the things, it's another element that can, I think, open this piece up to a variety of different interpretations. But
Yes.
I doubt that you would even say that one interpretation is necessarily correct compared to any other. Cool. Great. Well, I think I've covered everything that I want to cover. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
You had asked earlier about the other versions of this piece, because a piece like this doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
And so there are two earlier versions of this. One was a very short one, about 6 minutes long, which was commissioned by the previous Ear Taxi Festival. The festival took place in 2016, and I wrote it in 2015 into 16. And this was a commission from the Maverick Ensemble, and Jason Rainovich is going to be playing in this piece as well. And Jason was one of the primary people, along with Steve Butters, who performed that piece. And Jason had wanted a texted piece that had a political element to it. So, and that way the noise suddenly seemed to make sense. And after that, I started thinking, well, I want more people, more singers. And so I added, I had a classical singer and myself, and then Dee Alexander and Maggie Brown. So we had four of us. So we had jazz and classical voices. And I expanded the piece and made us a little bit more aggressive and funny. And this piece was called, the first piece was Clameur Mélodie, because I kept the French. And the second was Clameur des Voix, the voices, noise of the voices. And so that was in 2017. And after that, I had a workshop with money from DCASE, Department of Cultural Affairs and Exhibitions, I think. And that was about a 3-hour workshop where I didn't have electronics, but I had everybody amplified. And many of the people who are performing in this performance were in that. And we videoed it from 2 different angles, and I have a lot of recordings. And that helped me put the current piece together. I had given them sketches and some of the notation from the previous piece, and then we expanded it greatly. And there are little bits of these recordings from 2017, which have found their way into the soundtrack as well.
Oh yeah, and you also incorporated an excerpt from Man Song too.
Yeah, yes. I needed some texture. And so from the words wind howling, whoa, there were ling, 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 ling. I love ling, and ling kind of has a resonance. So I took from Mad Song and made it more electronic, and you will hear little bits of that. And then also the singers get to do that. And then I also have some pure electronics from another piece I wrote a long, long time ago, because I needed some filler to go into drumming. And also I use a traditional drum set, but also bucket drums, because the bucket drums are what we hear on the street. And as we might remember, Mayor Emanuel got really annoyed about that, and he tried to have some kind of decree where the drummers could no longer drum whenever they wanted. It was only certain times on weekends or specific hours. And so they were, well, you know, those of us who walk along the street love the drumming and the kind of wonderful rhythms that they produce. A lot of people in the offices said, that is so noisy, I just can't think. And the powers that be said, oh, get them off the street during working hours. So bucket drums are there as well. That's one of the reasons that we hear them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's such an important, necessary, I would say, part of the aural landscape of any major city, but certainly of Chicago. Like you can't escape it when you go downtown.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to
Yeah,
stop.
I think that's a good place. And if anyone's interested in some of the notation that I was using, I'm going to send some separate files to Ear Taxi, and they can put them either with this video or somewhere else. That would be okay, just to give other composers or people who are interested in seeing how do you create this, what it looks like on the page.
Awesome. Great. Well, that's it for us then. And thanks for watching, everybody. And we really hope that you can all come hear the piece performed. Again, this is a world premiere, and it's a commission for the Ear Taxi Festival. And we're performing it on the evening of Sunday, October 3rd at 7:30 at Constellation. So I hope you can make it.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the festival. It looks fantastic.
It certainly does. All right, so long.